Yeah, welcome to the first Enhanced Lunchinar. Today we will discuss racism, as you see on the slide. So today's topic will be racism. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this inaugural session of our Enhanced Lunchinars about diversity topics. These bite-sized learning sessions are designed to foster critical thinking and engage our university community and stimulate public debate. So our aim is to create a space where we can all learn and reflect on pressing issues in academia and society. Today's topic, racism, is of utmost importance. It's particularly timely as tomorrow marks also the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I will just make sure to mute you, please. So it would be lovely if you mute yourself. Of course, later in the discussion, feel free to unmute yourself. And exactly. So this is the first time that we are organizing this. And tomorrow marks even the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Racism is a deeply rooted issue that affects societies globally, and understanding its historical and structural foundations is crucial in addressing and dismantling it. But first things first, before we jump into the topic and listen to our speaker, I want to emphasize that this event, and such as all events of Enhanced Alliance, is a safe and respectful space for learning. This is what we try. So please consider the following points during this event, even it is an online event. Diversity is not always visible, but a diverse society requires that its members are visible to others. Meet everyone as their own self, please, and do not make any assumptions about gender or religion or family relationship, disability, sexual orientation, and other aspects of person's background, also not in an online event when you are listening to different discussion moments and to us. Encourage everyone's right to participate, and please listen to understand, not just to respond. We wander together and welcome, of course, questions and learn from mistakes. If you face or faced any situation, you can always contact me as the ombudsperson of the Enhanced Alliance after the event. My contact information is shared with you. Goals of the Enhanced Lunchinars. It's promoting dialogue and critical discussions. This is what we want to encourage as critical thinking and public dialogue on key areas or topics related to diversity in academia, like today's topic. We also want to provide engaging and practical learning. So at the end of the presentation, we will also share with you an interactive and useful tool. And we want to expand also accessibility and reach. So these Lunchinars are open to everyone. Mute yourself while you are just listening. Okay, sorry for that. Okay. Today's agenda, as you can see on the screen. So we will start with this introduction part. Basically, I'm almost finishing with that. And after that, this will be followed by an expert lecture by Professor Alexander Gamst. He is an associated professor from Department of Social Work at NTNU. Dr. Page has an extensive research background in migration, inclusion, discrimination, and racism topics, just to name some. His work explores how people construct explanatory models to understand the world around them, often containing irrational elements. Today, he will provide us with a historical perspective on European racism, tracing its origins in the colonial era, its legitimization through pseudoscience, its entrenchment in political and cultural structures. So during the presentation, you can also already collect your questions on Mentimeter. I will just show this to you very briefly, that you can see. Basically, you can, I will just put it in the Zoom chat for everyone. So you can basically click on this link and just keep this page open. It is a Mentimeter tool, a place where you can basically add any question anonymously that comes to your mind already during the presentation. And of course, after the presentation as well. And after the presentation, we will answer these questions as good as possible. After the lecture, we will have a moderated discussion moderated by me and Q&A with our speaker. You are encouraged to ask questions anytime, of course, in the Mentimeter. For whatever reason, when that doesn't work for you, it's also okay. Just use the Zoom chat. And if you want to say something, you can, of course, also raise your digital Zoom hand and get a word to ask your question to Dr. Page. And after that part, at the end of today's session, at the very, very end, we will conclude with a closing and practical takeaway where I will introduce a tool for you that you can share as a takeaway from today's meeting. Okay, that is my introduction so far. Let me just change my slide again. So, Alexander, we are coming to you. Let me first spotlight you here in Zoom, that everyone is able to see you on the screen. Here you are. And now I will just spotlight you. I hope everyone can see now Dr. Page on the screen instead of my slide. If it is not the case, please let me know in the chat. If I hear nothing, I assume it is the case. Yeah, Alexander, do you want to share your screen? And I give the word to you. So I'm seeing your screen now, but not in presentation mode yet. Now it is enhanced webinar. Yeah, it looks good.
Looks good now?
It's good now.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to Melih for that very kind introduction. It is an absolute pleasure and an honor to have been asked to speak today and to speak on a very important subject, which is the subject of racism. And I have a background in social anthropology before I got into social work, which is a discipline dealing with intercultural communication, intercultural understanding. And I'm currently involved in several research projects, but the one that I consider my main research project right now is on the experience of Muslim migrants to Europe. So racism is something that I deal with quite frequently in my research. Now, when speaking about racism, one very real issue is that it is a term that is used to describe a great many different phenomena. So when someone says that something is racist, it is sometimes hard to know what exactly it is they mean, because it can refer to sort of overt racism on the part of individuals. It can refer to sort of everyday insensitivities, what some people call microaggressions. It can refer to sort of unconscious biases, or it can refer to unfair laws or policies, or it can refer to sort of structural racism, where racist ideas have become sort of ingrained into the fabric of society in general. And in order to gain an understanding of racism, and obviously we're only going to be sort of slightly scratching the surface today, I find it useful to unpack these terms. And I'm also a great believer in the idea that we get a better understanding through a historical perspective. And in this case, how racism became or grew out of a specifically European idea arising out of colonialism. Now, I am by no means saying that only Europeans can be xenophobic. And in fact, xenophobia seems to be a fairly natural response and a more or less human universal. In both anthropological and historical studies of various societies around the world, we can see that basically every society has at least a certain degree of skepticism towards outsiders. But however, racism started as something else. It's not just a synonym of xenophobia. It is rather a system of human categorization that developed alongside colonialism and which still affects us today. When I lecture on this topic, I typically ask my students if they know what the significance of the year 1493 was. And usually no one can answer that. But then I ask, okay, what about 1492? And there's usually one or two then who know that, yeah, this was Columbus's voyage to the Americas. But I find that 1493, however, is a much more historically significant year because this was Columbus's second voyage when he returned to the Americas with more ships and more soldiers, more men, and basically set the premises for how Europe was intending to engage with the rest of the world. And he essentially started setting up an edifice of structural an edifice of exploitation and slavery that existed throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, and throughout Central America, and it was eventually overtaken by the British. Now, of course, we should mention that many societies have practiced slavery in some form, including Norway. I might mention, by the way, that many of my examples will either be from Norway because that's where I am, or from America because I find the racial history there, first of all, very interesting, and secondly, very well documented. So it's quite easy to make yeah, it's quite useful to make examples out of. Anyway, yes, many societies have practiced slavery in some form. Uh, what happened during colonialism, however, was something different, because this wasn't a punishment for wrongdoing. It wasn't sort of spoils of war. It wasn't something that you could sort of buy your way out of, or your children could sort of escape from. This was a This was a system that distinguished human beings into separate tiered sets of groups or races, where Northern Europeans were presented as inherently superior and other groups were presented as inherently inferior, especially darker skinned people. And this way, we can sort of think about racism as a kind of social technology that arose alongside colonialism and systematized exploitation in order to legitimize the systematized exploitation. And it was often framed as a charitable or even benevolent system where the colonialized peoples could not be trusted to be left to their own devices, and basically needed civilizing, and it was in their best interest to be controlled or subjugated, a doctrine that is known as the white man's burden. And there is sometimes an attempt to excuse this by saying that, oh, people didn't know any better. This was just a spirit of the times, and it was a natural stage of human progress of human advancement, and we eventually grew out of it. But this is something I like to push back against, because there were people at the time who who decried the exploitation and decried racism on moral grounds. One example that can be mentioned is Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a contemporary of Columbus. So, and also in the early days of colonialism, the Vatican called out against slavery. So, and then they later sort of came around and supported it. So saying that, yeah, it was a natural thing, and it was just the spirit of the times, uh, is not accurate, because it was controversial, and it was a topic of debate at the time as well. Now, racism was typically upheld by pseudoscience, and there are hundreds of examples we could bring up here, but we have quite limited time. So I'm going to we will confine ourselves to just one example, which is phrenology. Now, phrenology is interesting because it's based on several sorts of sequential ideas. First of all, it's based on the idea that human capabilities can be sort of encapsulated into distinct faculties. Secondly, these faculties are located in specific parts of the brain. Thirdly, the amount you have of a given faculty will affect the size and shape of that section of the brain. Fourth, the shape of the brain will affect the shape of the skull. So therefore, taking all these assumptions together, we can determine someone's intelligence, someone's character, someone's propensity for criminal acts, someone's skills, etc., from looking at their head. Um, and the beauty of this is that you can make you can make this really, really complicated so that you can look at someone's head and basically just arrive at whatever conclusion you want and still make it sort of sound plausibly scientific. And this was so popular that it was utilized in many places throughout the world, and it was still being used in Norway as late as the 1950s to quote unquote prove that the indigenous Sami were inferior to the majority Norwegians. And this was long after phrenology had been debunked as pseudoscience. Racism was also upheld by religion, and slavery also was supported by religion. Once the slave trade sort of was up and running, the Vatican kind of changed positions on it and began supporting slavery, and they also earned quite a bit of money out from it. But especially the churches in America of various denominations invested in slaves and owned slaves and rented out slaves, and they grew quite rich from this. And it's quite notable because the institutions that didn't sort of work the slaves themselves but rented them out were typically the most exploitative organizations to be owned by. So they were among the worst, among the worst slave owners at the time. And there are also several scriptural supports for slavery, such as Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Slaves, be obedient to your human masters with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. But the most important support for specifically racialized slavery is in the story of Noah. And now Noah had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and each of these sort of became, at least in the scriptures, became the forefathers of a tribe of people. And one day Noah was drunk and he passed out naked, as one does. And Ham, who was the forefather of the Canaanites, started laughing and making fun of his father. But his other sons held up a sheet, as you can see in the picture, and to protect their father's modesty. Now, when Noah woke up, he realized what had happened, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants to his brethren shall he be," or yeah, something along those lines. Now, Ham settled in Africa, and it became sort of tradition that that the darker skin of his supposed descendants was some kind of physical mark of this curse laid on Ham by Noah. And the implications of the saying, a servant of servants to his brethren is quite clear. It's used as a justification for why at this time in the colonial era, why dark-skinned people could be subjugated and could be made to slaves. Could be enslaved was a better way of saying that. I'm sorry. So we end up with a question: is race real? And scientifically, we can say that absolutely not. There's no scientific support for the doctrine of races. There are regional biological variations, sure, but there are no strict boundaries between them. Rather, they are the delineations are quite fluid. And there are also, even if we accept the idea that that we can talk about separate categories of people, the variation within those categories would be so much greater than the variation between them, and there would be huge overlaps. So there really is no scientific basis for talking about race. However, we can we can make an argument that race has become so ingrained into our culture and to our way of understanding and to our way of speaking about human variation and human difference that it that this in itself makes it take on a reality. It is for those of you who have some social scientific backing, it is a social construct. And now social constructs um, take on a reality from how we engage with them. It doesn't mean that something isn't real because they become real because people act towards them as though they are real. And fundamentally, when we start to construct institutions surrounding them, surrounding the constructs, they take on a reality. So it's an open question, I think, whether or not the concept of race can be said to be real. Now, excuse me, because of this history, racism exists and operates on many levels. As I intimated in the introduction, yeah. Sorry, let me back up. There are many different ways we can categorize racism, but this is a way that I find quite useful, and it is distinguished to distinguish between overt racism, decardio racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. Now, overt racism is quite straightforward. It is what we've been talking about up until now. It is the explicit doctrine that we can talk about separate types of human, and that some of these types are superior to others. Incidentally, this chap here with the swastika flag has always fascinated me because you can see from the creases in his banner that he has clearly just bought this and unfurled it for this rally. This is, of course, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. So I became interested. So where does one buy a swastika flag? So I Googled it, and I think I found where he bought it. And if anybody's interested, they actually have I swear I'm not making this up, a 3 for 2 sale on swastika flags. So if anybody needs 3 swastika flags but can only afford 2, then this is your lucky day. So let's move on. I'm sorry. He just really fascinates me. Now, um, although overt racism never really went away, uh, we saw throughout, especially from the 70s to the 2000s, that it became generally less and less socially acceptable in at least in Europe and America. And we see that for many people started at this time to move away from overt racism and into a more sort of covert form we might refer to as decardio racism or racism of the heart. Now, this still utilizes racialized discourses, but are more encoded and are more characterized by sort of plausible deniability, and often whilst giving sort of lip service to racial equality. Uh, it should be noted that Descartes racism is not the same as unconscious biases that we will touch on later. Descartes racism is typically more conscious, but with a sort of socially acceptable veneer over it. Now there are hundreds of examples, but one very typical example is how people might make anti-immigrant arguments by saying that no, I don't have an issue with immigrants generally. I just have an issue with those who come illegally. But when you actually scratch the surface and begin to dig a little bit about what they are saying, you can see that they are basically assuming that all refugees are illegal, whether they have come legally or not. And this is an example of sort of putting a kind of a socially acceptable veneer over what is generally a racist discourse. Now, interestingly, overt racism often acts as a sort of cover for this sort of covert racism, because having people like these around allow others to sort of point to them and say that, oh no, what I'm saying isn't racist. Marching with the swastika flag and shouting the Jews will not replace us, that's racism. What I'm doing is fine. Yes, it acts as sort of a cover for more Descartes racism. And what I'm going to say now might be an unfair parallel, but this sort of taking cover reminds me a lot about sort of films about racism made by white filmmakers, because there are a lot of very similar trends we see in those. Now, first of all, they're typically period films, sort of set in the past. The racism they depict tends to be overt, often a bit exaggerated, and resides in individuals. They also the ones that take place in America also very typically take place in the American South. And in the end, the racist individuals get their comeuppance, suggesting that racism has been ended. And that is also, I think, the implication of setting it in the past and setting it far away. The implication that no, it's not here. It happened over there and it happened in the past. And now I'm not suggesting that Spielberg, Beresford, or Farrelly are racist. I have no idea about their. I have no reason to think that, but I do see a parallel in this sort of shallow, simplified treatment of the subject, where I can't really see any other purpose than to, at least on an unconscious level, sort of wash their hands of race. Suggest, as I said, that it happened somewhere else and it happened in the past. And I'm particularly irked by the film Green Book, because part of it takes place in a sundown town. Now, sundown towns were a real thing, and arguably they still are a real thing. Now, the argument of whether they still exist is we don't really have time to get into now. If someone's interested, we can get into it in the discussion afterwards. But a sundown town is a town where only white people are allowed to stay after dark. And these towns existed all over America, but the film treats them as a specifically Southern thing that the New Yorker is surprised by. And the fact is that sundown towns were relatively rare in the American South, but were much, much more common in the American North, especially the states of Illinois and New York State. Yeah, that's yes, a little aside. I apologize. It's something I really wanted to get off my chest. Now, institutional racism refers to unfair laws or policies that target certain groups. For example, airport security guards profiling Arabs for extra security checks would be an example of institutional racism if this is a policy and not just a choice by individual security guards. And such laws may be overt or they may be covert. And what we often saw in this period where racism became less socially acceptable, we saw that that many of these laws and regulations went from being explicit to being more covert and more coded. One example of this is Norwegian stranger laws, because in the first stranger law in 1927, these were sort of precursors to immigration laws, by the way. In the first such stranger law from 1927, Jews and Romani were explicitly banned from entry into Norway. In the second stranger law in 1956, Jews were not mentioned and Romani were not explicitly mentioned, but the prohibition against Romani people still remained, but it now had been encoded into talking about vagabonds. But the wording of the law was relatively unchanged otherwise. So it still remained, but in a more encoded form. Now, structural racism in this sort of division is refers to how the categorization of people into these tiered groups has had a cumulative societal effect of racial stereotypes, assumptions, images, institutions, history, religion, etc. Now, it can encompass the other types of racism we have been through as well, because this describes sort of how racism becomes ingrained into the whole of society through these sort of mutually reinforcing systems. And once these systems are up and running, they no longer need racist sentiments on the part of individuals to be maintained. Now, I'll give you an example. We mentioned sundown towns earlier. These really started appearing between sort of 1880 and 1920. That's when they really took off. And because after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, African Americans spread throughout the country and settled everywhere, both in cities and in suburbs and in towns. But uh, especially in this time period, 1880 to 1920s, town after town start to drive them out through race riots, through lynchings, through threats, and they were driven out of the towns, out of the suburbs, and into the inner cities. This, by the way, this picture is from the Tulsa, the Tulsa riot or Tulsa massacre in 1921. Now, the inner cities typically have higher cost of living. They have more crowding, fewer teachers per student, less healthy environment in pollution, and a host of other issues. But one thing I'd particularly like to mention is that people who live in the inner cities predominantly rent their homes, whereas people who live in the suburbs and in smaller towns predominantly own their homes. So when African Americans were driven out of their homes, either the homes were burnt down or they were forced to sell at very, very decreased rates and driven into the inner cities where they predominantly rent. This both sort of prevents them from accumulating value over time, and it also locks them out from many of these tax incentives for owners and for homeowners. And in fact, in practice, they are then through their taxes subsidizing the tax breaks of suburban people. So you have you have a redistribution of wealth from the poorer African Americans to the statistically more prosperous white suburban people. But once this system had been established, the inequalities are reproduced from generation to generation, so that even if racial discrimination was ended today, it would still take decades before these inequalities were evened out. So it is a system that needed overt racism to be started, but once it was began, it no longer needs overt racism in order to be maintained. And in this here, it might be useful to think about the concept of societal superstructure. Marxist theory distinguishes between the material aspects of a society and the intangible aspects of society. The intangible aspects are things like ideology, religion, education, media, etc. And the idea is that the the superstructure sort of maintains and legitimizes the material aspects of the society. And we can also distinguish between an ideological superstructure, which is the things that are explicitly said, and the hegemonic superstructure, which is when things no longer need to be said, when they become unspoken, taken for grantedness. And in the example I just gave, it has become sort of an unspoken taken for grantedness that African Americans chose to settle in the inner cities, a view that which is relatively rarely challenged. And in general, the hegemonic superstructure is harder to alter because of its unspoken taken for granted nature. Now, we have sort of covered this, but racism is always based on something. No one has ever said the phrase, "I am currently having an irrational hatred response to you because of our different levels of melanin." You know, racism has always been rationalized, and we have seen religious and pseudoscientific rationales, but these eventually fell out of favor, and especially after the Second World War, having rationales based on some kind of biological basis started becoming especially as, especially unpopular, you might say, less acceptable. But as these biological explanations became less and less acceptable and less widespread, we see that cultural rationales start to take over. And when sort of racist statements or are made now, they quite often refer to cultural groups rather than sort of biological groups. For instance, Muslims are one of the most discriminated against groups in Europe, and this is mostly on cultural grounds, or at least utilizes as a cultural rationale. And we also often have the concept of cultural robots towards sort of the people who have been othered, and where you have an unspoken assumption that the majority can make their own decisions based on the situation, can make their own or can make their own choices, whereas minorities will more ultimately do whatever it is their culture dictates. As has been intimated, once these racist structures are set, they typically become taken for granted and become just a part of the societal structure. And it is very hard for individuals not to internalize these. Um, and and it can be argued that everyone has some kind of preconceptions or some kind of assumptions that have racist bases. Now, these can lead us towards discrimination without intending to. One example is from the Labour and Welfare Administration in Norway. Many of my participants, in my research projects, have related that when they go to the Labour and Welfare Administration, their caseworkers often start off by offering them sort of cleaning jobs and that kind of thing, without even having checked what kind of jobs they're qualified for, what if they have any degrees, if they have any specific qualifications, etc. And I would be shocked if this was some sort of intentionally racialized. I would be shocked if this was intentional. I think instead that they're just so used to the idea that minority equals low status jobs that as soon as they see as they see as they see a brown face, they immediately start thinking, okay, I have this cleaning job that might be suitable for this guy. Another very common experience in my Norwegian Muslim participants is when they are asked, where are you really from? And this is usually not taken by them as malicious, but it relies on an unspoken, take for granted assumption that Norwegianness equals whiteness, and that anyone who looks different, anyone who has darker skin, can't really be from Norway and must be from somewhere else, even if they are born in Norway. And one participant statement that always sticks with me is a woman who said, it is surreal to hear somewhere I've never been described as my homeland and a language I do not speak described as my mother tongue. Now, these insensitivities are often called microaggressions. And it is a term I'm not crazy about, to be honest. And I would prefer something like a cultural faux pas, but I'll come back to why. Because But in any event, we have seen, especially from the 2000s, 2010s, that an effort to increasingly become aware of these microaggressions and to call them out, which has been met with a corresponding backlash, especially from the political right and from conservatives. Because far from everyone agrees that microaggressions are a real thing or are problematic, and there is a view that calling these sorts of things out is an indication that the younger generation is becoming increasingly overly sensitive, with terms such as social justice warrior, snowflake, or woke being used to sort of what can I say? Yeah, I can't think of the word. I'm sorry. I'm just going to move on then. Um, become to being used to sort of suggest that these things aren't a real issue. We might say. Um, so we might ask ourselves the question of whether we have become too sensitive as a society. And it might not surprise you to know that I would argue no. However, I don't in any way blame the people who do think that microaggressions are not an issue, because many just don't know the historical underpinnings of the categories with which they operate, or just don't have the inclination to microanalyze the hidden implications of the words they use or the things that they say, or the things they say. So calling out these microaggressions might be seen as an attempt to drag them down from the sort of hegemonic space more into an ideological state where they can be questioned, they can be discussed, and they can be problematized. And I think this is a very commendable endeavor. And at the same time, I really understand why some people resist this, because racist has become such a deplorable term that if you say that everyone has some racist ideas, I can understand why a lot of people resist this. And it's also the reason why I don't like the term microaggression, because it's such a harsh term that I can understand that a lot of people don't want to associate this with themselves, and they don't want to admit to having inclinations which can be categorized as such. However, every system and every person has some structures and some inherent biases, and so it might be worth trying to find less loaded ways of talking about them to avoid using terms like racist that will just shut down many conversations before they really start. But at the same time, this is not the case for everyone, and we have seen that, as I said, overt racism never really went away, But since the mid 2010s, it became increasingly clear that it was much more widespread than social scientists had previously supposed, and it was sh a shocking amount of people who either were willing to use them or were okay with them entering sort of the right-wing political mainstream to an increasing degree. And I have to say, it's just I really can't get over this image of a person standing on a podium with the seal of the president of the United States, making a Nazi salute, or Roman salute, as he called it. Um, let's see, Melek, how am I doing for time?
Hmm. Yeah, maybe a couple of minutes if you still want to share more, and then we can catch up some questions that we have already.
Yes. Okay. I will skip a little bit ahead then. Um, um, yeah. In one sense, this might be seen as sort of a pendulum swing, and I hope that is the case. That the increasing sort of awareness of racism, the increasing willingness to call out racist discourses, has created a counter movement, which might then see the pendulum swing back again at a later date. But I have my doubts as to this, because the ability of subcultures to establish their own echo chambers has really been a game changer in this. I would argue, because we no longer really have a universally shared reality, that we have different where we just have different opinions as to how to interpret this reality. Instead, we seem to have different opinions, and then we construct different edifices of reality to support those opinions. And I still see a lot of research talking about the political mainstream, but I would argue we don't really have a political mainstream anymore, but rather a minimum of two competing sets of mainstream realities. And this is a really strange situation, and I find it quite scary, and it is it's quite hard to know where these things will land. But in the meantime, I would argue that our goal should be to become more aware of the ways in which we speak about others, and the assumptions we are utilizing, the assumptions we are relying on, and the assumptions we are perpetuating. And in this regard, it might be useful to remember that many of these assumptions aren't anybody's fault. No, none amongst us was a slave. None amongst us was a slave owner. We are not responsible for the system being established, but we can be part of deconstructing it. Um, yeah, because if you see a minority group represented over and over again in a certain way, and you hear them talked about over and over again in a certain way, it is only natural that you will get certain assumptions and certain stereotypes from this. So, and it doesn't make anybody a bad person to internalize these assumptions. However, what we should strive to do is to become more aware of them, and thus be able to deconstruct them. And in this regard, our host has a tool which he will share, which will help us to explore and become more aware of our own tacit biases. And since I just can't help myself bringing everything back to the classical world, we might remember the inscription associated with the oracle at the temple of Apollo, Gnoti Sauton, which means to know yourself. And this was presented as sort of the height of wisdom in ancient Greece, and I still think it is a very worthy goal that we could all aspire to today. Now I will give the word back to Meredith.
Thank
But thank you
you.
so much for your attention.
Thank you, Alexander. Very interesting and also useful and insightful to hear all this from about racism from the scientific perspective. Thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone who is still here. So we have some times and some questions from the Mentimeter. I will just make sure also to add my screen to the spotlight that you can see, hopefully, Alexander page and my screen. So let's start with the basically right now 2 questions that we have on the screen. And the first one that I have is what is the main motivation behind racist structures? I think that you were mentioning. And what's the main motivation behind that? Is it about keeping power against minorities? It's the first question that we have from the audience. And you can still, by the way, add more questions, everyone. Yeah, but let's maybe hear your brief answer to that if you want to elaborate.
Yes, of course. This is a very good question, and I think that historically this was the case that racist structures emerged as a way to sort of legitimize legitimize the exploitation of well, we call them minorities, but
Mhm.
yeah, sort of against non-white people, we might say.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that was how it started out. But we have to remember that there isn't any one actor here, right? There were both governments, there were both individuals who profited and had sort of vested interest in maintaining this. And in recent years, it has also become. We've also seen. I would say, for example, that a lot of politicians perpetuate these sorts of discourses in order to gain political capital. I mean, it is,
Mhm.
of course, very useful to be able to say that that yeah, it is not our fault. It's not our fault for mismanaging the economy. It is those guys
Yeah.
over theirs fault.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. Also, thanks also for the question. I hope it is answered in a comprehensive way for you. Even, by the way, the time is not enough. We will make sure to answer all the questions, even in the follow-up email in worst case. But we still have a couple of minutes before we come to the tool and the closing words. The next question on the screen is, how can we define microaggressions instead? Because I think you said you don't like that in a way. So, for example, where are you really? I like the question, where are you really from? So when it is it a microaggression or something else to define? I think this
Well,
is very important.
I think the term microaggression it has within it. I mean, it can be called a microaggression in itself because it's sort of implying that it is some kind of intentional aggression or intentional attack, and
Mm.
that is what I don't like about it, and that's why I would prefer a term such as a cultural faux pas, because this question here, for example, where are you really from? It is a faux pas because it assumes that someone isn't sort of
Mhm.
from here
Yeah,
when they often can be. So I mean, how to ask this particular question? I suppose you might ask something like do you have ancestry from some other from somewhere else? That
yeah,
might be at least a less loaded way of asking that
yeah.
question.
Thank you. Thank you. I will take up the last question. Even if some people, some visitors add more questions, we will make sure to answer them in the follow-up email if there is any. But it is the last question that I have so far, and after that, we will answer all the others potential questions in the follow-up email. The question or the comment is, I have heard that people of color are more racist towards white people than white towards people of color. Could this be true? Isn't it some sort of defensive response to all the bad they experience? Yeah, thanks for that question. That's the last one that our speaker will answer in this session right now.
Now, this is a very interesting question. As you can imagine, it is quite hard to sort of enumerate statistically how many, I don't know, racist units each person makes, and to to determine who is more racist. This has certainly become a talking point amongst certain political actors to sort of justify racial discourses. Sort of what about them? We are all equally bad, so nobody can criticize me. I do think that as the race courses became less acceptable, it was more acceptable to sort of punch up than it was to punch down. So I think sort of racism from people of color towards white people is more acceptable and something that you might hear more often. But it's very hard to answer if they're actually more racist, and I would assume not. I would think that it's probably less equal. It's just how it is expressed that is different.
Yeah.
Would be my assumption.
Thank you. All other questions, thanks for that, Alexander, and all your questions. We will also make sure that I will ask Alexander for some answers or comments if there are more questions added. I saw at least one more. Just looking at the time, I will just stick to our plan to keep you also in time. So we promised you a practical takeaway, a practical tool that we want to mention. I think this fits very well. Some of you might know it, the implicit association test, or implicit bias test, it's also called, that I want to briefly introduce. It's a very valuable tool for self-reflection, so to know more about you. I also did it several times because you can do several tests, and it is really very interesting, and it invites for reflection. It helps individuals to explore their unconscious biases and better understand how stereotypes may influence their perceptions. So you can access the test at the link that is mentioned there. You will, of course, get the presentation. So we encourage you to try out and reflect on your results. And if you want to make more work out of knowing more about yourself, I also share this link that leads to our innovative learning campus of the Enhanced University Alliance. So, and there are also relevant offers about, anti-bias topics, for example. For example, anti-bias lunch break is one of the other offers. And this was just the first webinar, but not the last one. We have some upcoming webinars. Friday, 9 May, how to counter arguments against diversity, in which we will focus on understanding the source of resistance to diversity issues. I think very relevant topic right now. And how to create an evidence-based narrative to foster diversity in our communities. And the next one is also after that set is about IT accessibility, slightly different topic, but also very important issue to have also accessible and inclusive IT structures around us. We will even add more information, more events in the future. To finish, thank you all for joining us today and for engaging in this important discussion, and for your questions and your comments. I will make sure to consider them in the follow-up email that will be sent to everyone who is registered. Thank you also to our expert for his invaluable insights. Thank you so much to come here. And basically racism is a systemic issue, and tackling it requires continuous learning and also commitment. So we hope today's session has provided you with valuable insights and new perspectives. And because it was the first webinar that we organized in the series and that we call Enhanced Lunchinars, it is very important to hear also from you how you like it. If you like it, tell it to others. If you didn't like it, tell it to me. And so then we can improve it. But everyone is, of course, invited, even if you like it or not, to complete the mini evaluation form. It takes, I think, just 1 or 2 minutes. And please stay tuned for our upcoming Lunchinars on other critical and important topics for our society. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future sessions as a topic, feel free to reach out. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you soon again in one of the next Enhance events. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye bye, everyone. Thanks for joining. Have a nice day. Bye bye. Bye bye, Saskia.